Lawson. I first was introduced to Ken through his book, George Whitfield and his journey through New England. Greg prayed for revival recently, just now, and Ken studied the answer to that prayer many years ago in our region. So looking forward to hearing Ken. He is an accomplished brother in the Lord. He's served our country with distinction as a chaplain in the Army, retired as a full colonel, and he's gone to school at Bob Jones University. He's a graduate of Westminster Theological Seminary as well. He was stationed there in the Philadelphia area, and he's a servant of the Lord. His wife Vera is just completing her PhD in a field that I have had trouble repeating. It has to do with oceans and climate, and it's very technical, and she's almost done. So very gifted couple that we're going to hear from. I have read Ken's book, and I would commend it to you. He's selling it to you for $15. I had to pay $25 for mine, for the record, but it was well worth the $25. What Ken has done is he's toured all these towns in New England, tracing the steps of George Whitfield during the Great Awakening. It's really hard to understand Baptist heritage in the United States without reference to the Great Awakening. As he visited town by town, I got the impression that he visited a lot of historical societies, a lot of church libraries and archives, and did a lot of research. And the Lord really used his book in my life in a personal way. I get asked a lot these days when I'm retiring. And in fact, Rand Hummel, the director of the Wilds, don't tell him I told you this, but every time I bump into him, he tells me, I heard you retired. And I don't know why he says that so much to me, but he does. And I tell him I'm not retired yet. But what was interesting about this book is Whitfield would go from town to town, and the way Ken describes those travels is he says that some pastors in that town would accept Whitfield's ministry, some would not. Ken would tell you who those pastors were. What they had in common is they all went to Harvard. They all were ordained a few years after graduating from Harvard. They all served in their churches, and then they all died, and nobody retired. So they served in their churches until their death. I read that phrase over and over and over again, and it was kind of an encouragement to me that as long as the Lord gives me energy today and his calling is still in my life, I'm not retired by his grace and mercy. So that's been an encouragement to me in and of itself. But just to see how the Lord can answer Greg's prayer and how he has done so before has been a great encouragement as well. I know you're going to enjoy hearing from Ken, and I won't take any more of his time.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm happy to talk to you today, this morning, about a topic that I have been very interested in for a few decades. Before I begin the talk, I want to mention that my approach this morning is going to be more of a teaching session. Question and answers are welcome, and I tried to leave a little bit of time at the end for more question and answers. So as I'm speaking, you're welcome to raise your hand or just shout and say, hey, Ken, I have a question. Or you might want to wait till the end and then maybe I'll cover it. But either way, I don't care. So it's up to you. Before I begin, how many of you have heard the name of George Whitfield? Let me backtrack. How many of you have not heard the name of George Whitfield before this conference? Never heard of him? Oh, okay. So the group is essentially somewhat familiar with him. That helps a lot for me this morning. He has been misunderstood. He is a forgotten founding father of the United States. George Whitfield had a huge influence on the major patriarchs of our nation, those who signed the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution. Vast numbers of those men were influenced in some way or another by George Whitfield, either being very much supportive of him and being very involved in the awakenings in the colonial time, or like Benjamin Franklin, very influential in the founding of the United States, but a skeptic and a friend of George Whitfield, but not a supporter. This is the year 2026. A movie came out this year by a Christian film producer whose name escapes me now, and it was called I think it was called The Great Awakening, and it was about George Whitfield and Benjamin Franklin's relationship. Anybody seen that? Okay, my wife and I saw it, and I would say that that movie was about 90 to 95% accurate, which is shocking. But it was done by a Christian movie maker. So, but knowing all of the minutiae of the details about Whitfield's life that I studied over the last decades, I was pleased that this film was accurate. Okay, so next slide, please. The purpose of our talk this morning is to introduce to you, or maybe introduce to you again, the greatest preacher, people say, in the English language. Now, we may have opinions on that, and that's fine, but he's often told that he understood to be that. And secondly, to understand how biblical evangelism changes lives from the inside out. Whitfield didn't preach to change the culture, he preached to change human hearts. And then the culture changed after that. And then lastly, to recognize the relationship between George Whitfield and the Baptists in New England. Now, my topic was George Whitfield and the Baptists, but there's certainly not enough time to do that. So then I thought, as it says on the screen, I'll do George Whitfield and the Baptists in New England. And then as I got more into that, I said, that's going to take a lot of time too. So I focused it even more. So now I'm George Whitfield and the Baptists in Connecticut. How's that for application? Here we are today. Okay. This gives just a simple background to Whitfield. Born in Gloucester, England, 1714. Very humble background. His parents owned a tavern. His dad died when he was 4. His mom remarried, and the marriage wasn't a good one. He was not raised in a Christian home. Interestingly, Whitfield, as a non-Christian preteen and teenager, was very involved and very interested in theater and drama. And that would later be used by the Lord, empowering George Whitfield after his conversion with the Holy Spirit, so that he had some speaking abilities that were nothing short of remarkable. We'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. He was able to graduate from Oxford University, which meant that he was very well educated. But he was able to graduate because he worked there as a servant. His family was poor, so they had a program there where you could go as a student, but you had to take care of the dorms. You had to clean the bathrooms, you had to clean up the kitchen area, you had to sweep the floors and other things, and that took off the tuition for him. So as a poor young man, he was still able to be a college graduate. He was ordained in 1736, but he was not granted a local church ministry. And the reason for that is not very clear. Part of it, the biographers say, was envy, because he was such an articulate speaker that people were jealous of him. Some people said he was young and rash and wasn't ready for a local church ministry. So he took initiative and began doing something that was completely and totally unheard of at that time. And that was to do outdoor preaching. And that caused an unheard of scandal in London, and then eventually throughout the UK, and then into the US colonies. His first mission trip outside of Great Britain was to Georgia, the state of Georgia, southern colony of the United States. He was successful. 2 things came to his mind when he went to Georgia. One, he saw the need for an orphanage. Georgia was a place where a lot of the British folks sent their debtors and sent their prisoners and sent their troublemakers to the Georgia colony. And those troublemakers had children, families and children. Children were orphans, the parents died, they had addictions and other things. And so he saw the need for an orphanage. And secondly, for the first time in his life, he saw African-American slavery, and it made him sick. And so he wanted to have an orphanage to help minister to Southern people. He came to New England. After going back to England, came back to New England, which is kind of the focus of what we'll be talking about this morning, in 1740. And in 1740, the Great Awakening occurred in the American colonies. This was from New England to Georgia. All 13 colonies were shooken by the preaching of Whitfield as an itinerant minister. It's interesting because George Whitfield kept a diary, and that diary is still in print. Banner of Truth Trust prints that diary, is still in print, like I said. And it's really interesting to read how he went from place to place to place, including the area right around here. I have a map to show you in just a little bit. The most famous man in the American colonies in 1770, when George Whitfield died, had the initials of GW. But it wasn't George Washington. It was George Whitfield. His name was known throughout all of Great Britain and the 13 colonies. Now, this is a little bit of a busy slide. This is the busiest one I have. And I have this slide up there because it requires a little bit of history background, especially where we are right here in our part of Connecticut. The Great Awakening profoundly impacted Connecticut, where small local religious revivals in the 1730s, typically influenced by Jonathan Edwards, these small revivals escalated into a colony-wide movement that challenged the rigid authority of the established churches and sparked deep religious, social, and political shifts. Essentially, what happened during that time was the churches of New England, and we'll just say Connecticut, were getting into a routine of Puritanism. The first, second, third, fourth, and fifth generations, the Puritan message of the gospel of Jesus Christ alone for salvation had started to become compromised. Different denominations had come in, different free thinking from Europe had come in, and now you had churches that were established by the colonial government in Connecticut, where the Congregational Church was the state church in Connecticut, and you had to conform to those principles of doctrine in the practice in that church. And what happened was it all got stale. It all got too familiar and too routine. Well, the next little point there says, George Whitfield's tour in 1740, he came preaching an impassioned, energetic, emotional, enthusiastic, open-air sermons that drew massive crowds, but alienated him from the more formal, established clergy who did everything just the same way every week. And Whitfield comes and he says, I would like to come to your community and speak in your church. And the minister may say yes or he may say no. If he says yes, the meeting could be in the building. And a lot of the accounts in Connecticut and other places is when the meeting would be in a building, they had to open all the windows because the crowds were in the hundreds or thousands outside to hear him. And remember what I said about his voice? It projected so loud. Benjamin Franklin did an experiment. He was the scientist, the rationalist, the logistician. So when George Whitfield, just for an illustration, was in Philadelphia, Benjamin Franklin said, I don't believe these reports that I'm reading that George Whitfield preached to 20,000 people on the Boston Common and people could hear him. And then when he went to Portsmouth, New Hampshire and spoke outside to 18,000 people, that can't be true. So George Whitfield's in Philadelphia. Benjamin Franklin gets out his pad, his measure, and he's measuring the courtyard, and then he does his calculations, and he says, this courtyard can fit 25,000 people. Then George Whitfield comes, the place is packed with people, and Whitfield starts to speak. Benjamin Franklin says, I got him. He's a fraud. So Benjamin Franklin goes to the back end of the congregation, way back, 25,000 people, way back. George Whitfield starts to speak, and Franklin was shook because it was as if he was talking to him in the same room. So I can't explain the oratory of Whitfield. I don't know how to explain that, whether it's natural talent, Holy Spirit anointed, but something about the way he communicated was able to project not only the volume and the tone, the enunciation, but the actual gospel message, the Bible projected with that kind of authority. It just shook people. There's no other way to say it. People would cry. People would shake, and not the emotional extremes of other types of revivals and awakenings that the charismatic and Pentecostal people do. People were just shook into the bone. The word of God came and smacked their hearts. Well, that caused a split in New England, as the third point on the screen says. The old lights versus the new lights. The movement of the Whitfield movement, the Great Awakening, caused severe fractures within the Connecticut religious establishment. The traditional clergy were the old lights. They resisted the revival, while the evangelical camp, the new lights, promoted it. This eventually led to the growth of the numerical growth of denominations like the Baptists and the Methodists in New England. In their zeal, some of these new lights went to extremes. There was a person named James Davenport down in New London, not a couple hours from here or so. He really caused quite a fuss in Connecticut and discredited a lot of the revival and awakening in the Connecticut colony. And after 1740, when Whitfield's coming through, people are like, their jaws are dropping. This is incredible. I've never heard preaching like this before. But after he left, then it started, the people, well, he didn't come and get permission, or, well, he really spoke outside, and we don't do that, or, well, Whitfield came and they spoke outside, but in church, the men sit on one side and the women sit on the other side, but when they went outside, they all intermingled. Oh, no! And people started talking and fussing about it. Here's a map for all of you Connecticutites, if that's a word. George Whitfield came from the north, from Massachusetts, crossed over. He was with Jonathan Edwards, then crossed over into Suffield and came south around, this is where Route 91 would be. Maybe some of you drove this way like I did yesterday. Suffield, Windsor, Wethersfield, Middletown outside of Hartford, and then kind of went southwest. And you can see the towns that are mentioned there along the coast. One place that, and this is kind of a question for you to just speak out. One place Whitfield always visited when he came to Connecticut was New Haven. Why?
They sail in and out of New Haven a lot.
New Haven was a major port. That is true. That's one of the reasons. There's a school there. Yale. We're going to talk about Whitfield and Yale. At first, I'll just tell you the summary. During 1740, Yale was 100% supportive of Whitfield. They loved him. They closed classes. The students and the professors all went outside. Whitfield preached. There were conversions. And then people that were converted went and started ministries in New England and did missions work. And it was terrific until the cold, liturgical, established sponsors of Yale, who financially endowed the school, said, whoa, slow down. You did what? He said, what? What do you mean we have to be born again? What do you mean? Who said that? And so tension and friction started, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Next slide. If you're interested in knowing anything or more detail about the Great Awakening and George Whitfield in Connecticut, here are two publications that are currently in print or currently available on the internet, or Amazon sells them and such things. One is published by the state of Connecticut, the one on your left, and the other one is a book by a Christian author on the right. Go ahead. Okay, so let's focus in on Connecticut and this George Whitfield person. He made 4 preaching tours through Connecticut, and the 1740 tour was the most sensational, with thousands and even tens of thousands of people hearing the gospel message. But after that, some clergy came out against him because he ministered outside the established churches. Many clergy were against his preaching on the new birth. And many ordained clergy throughout Connecticut were converted. Now they're pastors, they're ordained, they're in churches, they're doing ministry, and they're getting born again after Whitfield's tour through Connecticut in 1740. And over 4 preaching tours, Yale College, which I mentioned a minute ago, in New Haven, supported, then did not support, then supported him again. And there's another map in the next slide here. So you can see again, this is the 1745 trip through Connecticut, more towards the southeast part of the state, but again, hitting New Haven, which was always an important stop for him. Next slide, please. Here is the 1754 trip for those of you who traveled, like I traveled from northern Vermont, where we live. But if you're from Rhode Island or southeastern Massachusetts, I met somebody yesterday here that was from Attleboro. In the book, there's a whole section, several pages of information about how Attleboro responded to George Whitfield and how the pastors there listened to him or didn't listen to him. Really interesting stuff. Attleboro isn't on the map there, but Marlborough is in Taunton, so we're in the general area for you. Okay, next map, Vera, please. This is the 1764 trip in southern New England. Anybody here from Rhode Island? Okay, the couple of important places in Rhode Island, Providence and Newport. Newport especially because it was a haven for the Baptists in New England. For historically, Newport and Rhode Island, all of Rhode Island, but especially Newport, was a very strong center for Baptists in New England. And when George Whitfield came through Newport, he was welcomed by the Baptists, preached for the Baptists, and revivals happened in Baptist churches in Newport, Rhode Island. Okay, next slide. So the question is, what made Whitfield successful? Well, several things. His oratory skills and his dynamic preaching style in a time period where people would stand and speak slowly and in a monotone way. He was shouting to the people, and the people, whoa! And he was marching around, and he was pointing and making illustrations and applications to people. And the people were like, whoa, what's going on here? Because the established clergy of that time were very intellectual. They often used prayer books to read prayers. There was no spontaneity, and Whitfield never preached with notes. It all came from his personal study and his ability as an orator to sway the crowds. Really remarkable. Open-air preaching made him successful, something that he pioneered. Accessibility to common people. This is a huge, huge thing for him, and it applies to us directly today. Because George Whitfield made himself available to everyone. That means he didn't wait inside the walls of the church building for people to come to him. He went to them. When he was along the seacoast, he went to the wharfs and spoke to the fishermen and the lobstermen and the guys loading and unloading the boats. When he was working in the woods of New Hampshire, ministering to folks in rural communities, he went out to where the lumberjacks were felling trees and had Bible studies and revival meetings and prayer sessions in the woods with the lumberjacks. He went to these different places. One that's in particular is a really interesting story where people were mining. People were in coal mines and other kinds of mines in the UK and the American colonies. And he would go into the mines with a lantern and preach to the miners who were covered in filth. And the accounts of the eyewitnesses are that the miners were converted in the mines, and the tears from conversion and repentance were running down their faces. So they had white streaks all on their faces because they were crying, because they got right with God from Whitfield going into the mine. So there's an application for us. If you want to go and reach people, you don't stay within the walls of your building. You go out where the people are and share the good news with them. The simplicity of his message was very important because he did not preach over the heads of the miners, the lumberjacks, or the fishermen, and he used illustrations from their everyday life and Bible stories from the scriptures to teach the history of the Bible to fishermen. He talked about Peter the fisherman, illustrations of lumberjacks, and talking about the cedars of Lebanon as one of the servants that he used to talk to lumberjacks. And the accounts of the journals say They were leaning forward, listening to him to talk about what were the cedars of Lebanon. If you're in the felling of trees business, if you're a lumberjack, that interests you. So I say all that because the simplicity of his message, the vivid sermon illustrations, and his long-term consistency. Whitfield started preaching outside around after his ordination, so say 1746, 47, something like that. And the message stayed the same until he died in 1770 in Massachusetts. Same message, same gospel, over a whole career in ministry. One of the things that I am encouraged by Whitfield is that he was not perfect. And I have a whole slide next after this about questionable things about his life. But he learned from his mistakes. He didn't focus on denominational distinctives, which made him available to everyone. For example, in the colonial period, there were Baptist churches, Congregationalist churches, Methodist churches, Quakers, Episcopal folks, and others. And Whitfield preached outside, and he didn't care what denomination you were from. He cared about regenerated hearts. Do not leave this meeting, he would say, the way you came. Jesus is there to save you and to cleanse you and to heal you, to regenerate you, to sanctify you. And everybody from different denominations and different backgrounds, or no denomination and not churched, listened and were impressed that he was able to relate to them where they were at that point in their lives. He practiced a routine self-examination, which is sometimes something we lack. You know, how are we doing with the Lord? How's our prayer life? How's our marriage? How's our family? How's our ministry? His letters, which are, many of them are preserved, he's talking about, Lord, forgive me for this. Lord, I'm sorry for that. Lord, help me to make restitution for this. He was always self-examining. He expected criticism and learned from it. Whitfield knew that followers of Jesus are to be, it's expected that we are criticized, that we are mocked, and that we'll have hardship. When he took that criticism, he learned from it. He took that opposition, he grew through it. If you read his sermons, and there's 3 volumes of them available, they are very biblically based sermons. He starts with the text, he does an exegesis of that text, he looks for applications of that text, then he goes back to the text, and he pushes the truth of that in its historical and grammatical context to the congregation itself. And he said, this is what you need to do. And many people did it. And finally, he was theologically conservative and very precise in his doctrines, which he acquired from the Protestant Reformation. He was a big fan of the Westminster Confession and also the Philadelphia Baptist Confession of Faith. Next slide, please. So some questionable attributes now of Whitfield. In his youth, he was often impulsive, name-calling, got into petty arguments. Whitfield lacked a life balance. All of his biographers say this. He lacked a life balance between ministry, family, and rest. That sound familiar to anybody today? George Whitfield had an unfulfilled marriage. Everyone that writes about him realizes that his marriage was not good. He married in his late 20s. At first, his wife traveled with him in his ministries, but for the last 2 decades or more, she did not. She was not healthy. When he would come home to Great Britain and go and see his wife, he'd be there a day, and then he'd be off preaching again for a week here or 10 days there. He'd come back home, spend a day or 2, he'd be off preaching again. When he left for the American colonies, he could be gone 1.5 years or 2 years, and he didn't bring his wife. She had multiple miscarriages. They had 1 child that survived birth, but died about 1 year old. And so he never had any surviving children. It was a very strained marriage. Whitfield was financially careless. That was related specifically to the orphanage in Georgia, which I had mentioned a minute ago or a couple minutes ago. He didn't keep good financial records. Not that there were accusations against him throughout his life of financial embezzlement and inconsistencies in the finances. None of it was true. It was just something that his enemies could grab onto. and never justified, but still he was careless about his finances. And one of the things that he's also criticized for is what is after evangelism. So he goes into a community, like here in southwestern Connecticut. He goes into a community, has meetings outside on the town common, and lasts several days or weeks, and then he leaves. But then what? What happens to those people? He said it this way. He said, my goal, my life, my passion is to preach the gospel. And that compels me. That pushes me forward. That is the energy that gives me the power to speak about Jesus every day and sometimes several days or several times a day. And then he move on. But like I said, what about the people left behind? And that's a big problem. Those people, some people came behind and caused trouble. Some people came behind and split churches. One of the interesting, I was having a talk with someone this morning, and we're talking about churches in New England, how in many communities you have a congregational church and then you have the second congregational church. Maybe in your hometown you have something like that. If you want to try something fun, find the date for the second congregational church. Because many of them, and in my research, most of them, around 1740, 1750, they split. And you know why? Because of Whitfield, preaching of the new birth, the Great Awakening. The established churches didn't like the new message. For them, the new message, the biblical message, they didn't like it. So a group split apart and formed the second church of whatever town, second congregational church or whatever, second Baptist church, whatever the name of the church would be. Okay. Slavery in the American colonies. Whitfield was the first person to write against slavery in the colonies, coming from Great Britain and then traveling through Georgia and the Carolinas and Virginia. He was sickened by what he saw. And yet, later in his life, maybe a decade or so later, when the orphanage started in Georgia, he ran it with slave labor. So that is a big block, a big blemish on his testimony. And lastly, about questionable attributes of George Whitfield, he was very careless about his health. So those of you in ministry here or married to someone in ministry, or just everybody in the audience this morning, think about caring for your physical health. Think about pacing yourself. Think about how much you can do. Think about when is the right time to say, no, I can't do that. No, I need to spend time at home. I need to spend time with my family. I need to rest my body to be able to be fresh for more future ministries. He had a hard time doing that. And he died at age 55 of a respiratory disease in Newburyport, Massachusetts. Okay. This slide talks about George Whitfield and the Baptists. But for background, that English-speaking Baptists broke from the Church of England over doctrines and practices. In America, they were harassed. The Baptists were harassed by the Puritans in Massachusetts and Connecticut. George Whitfield had an interesting relationship with the Baptists during his life. The left side of the slide says the tensions that existed, and the right side speaks about how they had congeniality, they had fellowship in some things, unity in some things. The tensions were Whitfield was ordained by the Church of England. That's the very group that was persecuting the Baptists in Great Britain who came to America, and yet Whitfield had that ordination. Another thing that was a problem for the Baptists in Whitfield was Whitfield used the Book of Common Prayer first in his junior years as a pastor. Then he began to preach more extemporaneously, is that the word? Extemporaneously, meaning without notes, no memorized prayers, no sermon notes, just from his heart and from his study. The idea of a state church. Whitfield, as a Church of England minister, was part of the state Church of England. Well, anybody who knows anything about Baptist history says that is not going to pass. Whitfield accepted infant baptism. A horrible thing for Baptists to accept. Yet the Baptists of that time accepted Whitfield because of his message of the new birth. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So that's some of the tensions, but now the collegiality part on the other side of the slide. Both Whitfield and the Baptists completely rejected the Roman Catholic Church. The separation of the church above the secular government was something that was very important to Whitfield and to the Baptists. The new birth, apart from human works and religious ceremonies, critical, vital part of Whitfield's preaching and for the colonial Baptists. The independent status of a Christian before God, critical in Whitfield's preaching, that a Christian, a believer, needs no priest, no minister, needs no mediator, direct access to God. We call it in Baptist culture the priesthood of all believers. And Whitfield was a huge advocate of that. And so were Baptists. So they had a lot in common. And they had to kind of squirm as they worked together in some things because the overall picture was, you must be born again. Okay, next slide. Now I have I could put a dozen easily here, but I just picked one. And I think that there's a talk on Isaac Baptist later, today or tonight or tomorrow or sometime. But there are multiple key Baptist leaders in the American colonies. Isaac Backus is one of them. He was a very prominent New England Baptist leader, and he was profoundly awakened by Whitfield's preaching tour in 1740, and then again in 1745. And there's a little bit of background about Isaac Backus. You can take a minute to look at that because someone is going to be speaking about him in detail. The thing that I like about Isaac Backus, or one of the many things, is the last sentence there. I mentioned in my opening comments that George Whitfield was influential in the founding fathers of our nation. And one of those ways was through Isaac Backus. Isaac Backus supported the American Revolution as an outward expression of the inner freedom all true Christians have in the new birth through Jesus Christ. He had no allegiance to a king or a bishop. Okay, next slide. Here's another name. I heard this name downstairs this morning when we were having some breakfast. Another key Baptist leader influenced by Whitfield was Shubal Stearns, a key figure in the expansion of Baptist ministries in the southern colonies. He was one of the New Lights who embraced Baptist views after being stirred by the revivals through Whitfield and Gilbert Tennant, who focused more in the Pennsylvania, New Jersey area. In 1754, Shubal Stearns moved to North Carolina, established Sandy Creek Baptist Church, and from there, dozens or even hundreds of churches were started. Next slide. Whitfield, as I'm mentioning, had a key relationship with Baptist leaders in the colonies, and here's another one, Daniel Marshall. This was Shubal Stearns' brother-in-law, fellow itinerant preacher. Marshall was also impacted by Whitfield, heard him preach in Connecticut twice in the 1740s. Marshall was converted, and with his brother-in-law, they formed the Sandy Creek Association, and Marshall started a Baptist church and began starting dozens of other churches in rural Georgia, all from New England, mostly from Connecticut, but all from New England, Baptist, Whitfield, church planting, going out to share the gospel in a Baptist culture from George Whitfield's emphasis on the new birth in his revivals. So, some lasting influence of Whitfield on the Baptists. Like historic Baptists, he personalized preaching so that people thought he preached directly to them. That's one of the most wonderful compliments I can get from someone who I talk to or preach to or share with. Well, I felt like you're really talking to me. A lot of people said that about him because of the way his voice and his compassion compel people to listen. Like historic Baptists, Whitfield practiced energetic evangelism that reached across denominational lines. His open-air preaching created a culture of spiritual revival that became a permanent hallmark of evangelical Baptist identity. In other words, this morning, do not be content in your Christianity. Grow. And lastly, on this slide, it says, his insistence on the new birth for direct access to God meant that no person needed a king or a priest to reach heaven. He firmly held to the church over secular government, what Baptists today call separation of the state from the church. So I have a few quotes here that were kind of interesting, pulled out of his sermons. He said, "I would rather wear out than rust out." What's that mean? Always want to be busy, always want to be active, don't want to be idle, because if I'm idle, I'm going to get rusty and slow and break. Yeah, but George, you got a wife, your health. You didn't listen. You said, "God forbid that I should travel with anyone a quarter of an hour without speaking of Christ to them." That's an evangelistic mindset. Other men may, this one's a good one. "Other men may preach the gospel better than I, but no man can preach a better gospel." You got to think about that one a minute. I like that. He said, "Come, poor, lost, undone, sinner, come just as you are to Christ." Here's a couple of quotes about faith and grace. What? Can you get to heaven on your own strength? Why, you might as well try to climb to the moon on a rope of sand. Wow, okay. True repentance will entirely change you. I like that. "I have just put my soul as a blank into the hand of Jesus, my Redeemer." That's the testimony of a committed life. Here's a few quotes from his thousands of sermons. "Study to know him more and more." Just think about that. Why do you study? Is it to gain your own intellectual stimulation, or is it to know Jesus better? It's a poor sermon that gives no offense. And he said, and this prayer actually came true. He said, "Let my name die everywhere. Let even my friends forget me, if by that means the cause of the blessed Jesus may be promoted." And Whitfield was essentially a forgotten person for, I don't know, maybe 200 years, from 1770 to 1970. And then around the 70s, he got rediscovered. Next slide. He got rediscovered by church history people, both in the UK and in the United States. George Whitfield and Baptists of today causes us to have a few things to think about. Consider how the gospel you share can be understood by all types of people, like fishermen, and lumberjacks, and miners. How effectively are you communicating to people? Realize that the church is people and not a building. Now we know that, but in his day, Whitfield's day, it was considered scandalous to preach outside of a building. Matter of fact, one of his contemporaries and often critic, John Wesley, when Whitfield started preaching outside, Wesley wrote in his journal and said, "Before Whitfield, I thought it would be a sin to ever preach outside of a local church." So all ministry had to be within the four walls of a building. They didn't understand that the church is not a building, it's people, and you go to where the people are to minister the word of God. Radical change in Whitfield's time. As we think about Whitfield and the Baptists today, we realize there are fundamental Christian doctrines that must be defended. Inspiration and inerrancy of the Bible. He was completely inflexible, totally for it. The new birth, non-negotiable. Grace, mercy, critical. Blood of Christ, essential for salvation. Atonement, repentance, sinfulness. All of these things were core doctrines that he was able to speak to people about in a way they understood, and it changed their lives. And also, as we look at Whitfield's life, there are Christian practices that are non-essentials. And in Whitfield's day, those were things like, how often do we do communion? Once a day, once a week, once a month, once a year? Is that something worth fighting about and fussing about? Men and women sitting or standing together outside at church services. I mentioned this a minute ago. In a typical colonial New England church service during Whitfield's day, the men are on one side and the women are on the other side. But outside, they're all intermingled, and people thought that was scandalous. There was immorality going on, and adultery and fornication at Whitfield's meetings because the men and the women were standing together outside. It was nonsense. But that's what some people criticize Warren Whitfield says it's not an essential outside that the men go on one side and the women are another. Not everybody agreed with him. Another thing non-essential that he considered was foot washing. Some of the churches that he ministered to practiced foot washing, some of them didn't. Some of the Baptist folks enjoyed foot washing, and we consider Baptist churches as having 2 ordinances. Some of them in New England had 3, and it was foot washing. Is that something to fight over or fuss over? Whitfield didn't think so. Here's another one of his day, hymn singing or psalm singing. Before Whitfield, psalms were sung, but in Whitfield's day, hymns are starting to come in, and churches are fighting. Should we sing hymns? Should we sing psalms? What if we do both? What if we do one in the morning and one in the evening? And people fought, and he said, no, then don't fight about that stuff. Another thing I mentioned already about preaching inside a church building or outside. The Bible version that Whitfield used was the Geneva Bible it was written in 1560, and then it was reissued in 1599. And then the King James Version came out in 1611 and was reissued in 1638. Some of the churches in New England used the Geneva Bible from the Puritan roots, and some used the King James Bible. And Whitfield didn't care. It was English, there were good translations, and he preached from either one depending on the context of where he was, what his host required or requested. Next slide. And this is my last slide, and then I think I'll have time for questions. What you see there is the cover of the book. Over about 20-year period, off and on, mostly off, I guess, but off and on, I researched this book. And when I retired from the Army several years ago, after 34 years of service in the military, I had some time. And so I finished up. There's some research that I actually had in hanging manila folders in a filing cabinet, and was able to write this out and get it published, and it's available. Several of you have already bought copies of this, and they're for sale downstairs. And Pastor Bob said I could give a plug here, so I will. The book has a price on it that says $35. My cost is $15, and that's your cost. So if you want a book, and I'll sign it for you, about George Whitfield's life and ministry, it's about 500, I think, pages, or some big, thick book. And I get no profit from it, but I want to get that to you. So if you have an interest in this, I encourage you to get a book. If you have folks in your church that you think might benefit from it, get a book. If you have a historical society in your town or a public library that you think could benefit from this, get a book. Get the word out about Whitfield and his ministry that shook New England and Connecticut, especially for this talk today, with the preaching and teaching of the Bible in its historical, grammatical, and literal sense, with an emphasis on the new birth and a direct relationship to God through Jesus Christ. So that finishes my talk for this morning, but I wanted to leave time for questions. Any questions related to Whitfield, the Great Awakening, or anything like that? I'll try to answer, please.
I have a two-sided question. One is, when he came from England to America, is that just his idea? Was he sponsored by someone? How did he decide to leave there and come on the tour? Second part of the question is, when he preached, was there an invitation given? How did they deal with the law?
Okay, the first question was, don't tell me, who sponsored him when he came? It was himself. Yeah, he would preach outside or inside. He would take a collection, and then that money would be used to pay for his fare to come over. Whitfield was a very fluent correspondent and wrote thousands of letters, not hundreds, thousands of letters, and he would arrange his transportation. So he would write a letter to the ship captain, okay, and then he would write a letter to a pastor in Boston that would receive him at the dock, and then he'd write letters all the way through New England, and then into Connecticut, and the maps I showed you. He's writing to these people ahead of time. And then he had people that would go forward and say, in 2 days, Whitfield will be in New London, and then he's going to be in Hartford. And he would send people ahead to get to share the message, and people would use word of mouth. They couldn't text back then, so. Yeah. So the second question was what? I'm sorry.
Invitation, did he give an invitation?
Yes, at the end of all of his sermons, and there's 3 volumes of them, his invitations went something like this. Do not leave this place the way you came. If you came unconverted, you need to be converted to Christ. If you came here a Christian, leave here a better Christian, a dedicated Christian, a committed Christian, an evangelistic Christian. Do not leave. And the accounts say his voice would rise and he'd start pacing around and he'd start banging. He said, do not leave this place. In this thunderous, theatrically trained voice. And people, whoa. So yes, to answer your question, yes. Please.
About how long did he preach? I mean, what were the services like? Were they long sermons, short sermons?
Typically an hour to an hour and 15 minutes each sermon. And most of the people, if it was outside, they stood the whole time. And inside is obviously more comfortable, weather permitting, it's not too hot, but they're about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes. And when you read them, like I have read so many of them, and I timed myself, and I would actually read the sermon. And when I read it, it was 30 to 35 minutes. And so why did I read it for 30, 35 minutes and he would speak twice that long? I don't know. I do know that his sermons were transcribed by newspapers. And so editors would have abbreviated things, but about an hour to an hour and a half. Benjamin Franklin said, I stood here for an hour and 15 minutes and it felt like it was just a moment. No, you had a question already. Go ahead, Mark.
Did he use music also, or was it just
No.
just preaching?
Yeah, he had a portable pulpit, traveled in a carriage, had a portable pulpit that kind of what's the word? Unfolded, and he would put it at a prominent place, and he would step up on this thing, and he just let it up. And other places, there are several places in New England called Pulpit Rock, where he would climb upon a granite boulder and preach from a boulder in a field. And there's pictures of these places. Everything that I'm saying today is in the book with lots of photographs, lots of charts, pictures of ministers from Connecticut and this part of Connecticut that have agreed with him or disagreed with him. Connecticut Historical Society was very helpful and other places, of course.
A question, a comment where I think I shared this with you. Church I grew up in, Lambert Baptist in Massachusetts. In Newburyport, there was Pulpit Rock. We had our sunrise service on that area.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah, nice. There's a picture of it in the book, actually. Yeah.
2 questions also. One, did Whitfield suffer from severe strabismus, cross-sightedness?
Yes.
And then secondly, can you just describe the relationship between Whitfield and Wesley at the time? You mentioned there was some tension.
Yes. The first question is, Whitfield was born with a defect related to one of his eyes. He had vision that was fine, but one of his eyes was a floating eye, and I didn't understand the medical word that you use. I don't know that term, but he had a floating eye. It was glassy and kind of like if he's just looking at something, his eye would move. And they ridiculed him. The people who hated him ridiculed him, called him Dr. Squintum, because they thought he was squinting because his eye was constantly kind of irritated. So he had a lifelong physical defect. And the second question was about Wesley. Wow. Okay. That's a tough one. Not a tough one, a long one, but I'll give you the main points. Whitfield was converted at Oxford University as a young man. The 2 Wesley brothers, John and Charles, were also there a couple of years in school ahead of Whitfield. They saw how Whitfield was picked on by the other students because he was a servitor, cleaning the bathrooms, cleaning the rooms, preparing food, all of that stuff. And they kind of befriended him. So Whitfield and the Wesleys joined this club on Oxford University. They called it the Holy Club. And they were dedicated students that wanted to live right and pure before God. So they were working their way to achieve some righteousness. They were practicing fasting. There was sleep deprivation. There was hours and hours of prayer and Bible reading to force themselves to be able to get closer to God. And they had no concept of grace and forgiveness and the new birth. And so that relationship became strained after Whitfield was converted. And then the Wesleys were critical of Whitfield for preaching about all this new birth stuff. Then the Wesleys were critical about Whitfield going outside and preaching out in the outer doors. It was John Wesley, who I quoted a minute ago, who said, it would be as if a sin to think that I could ever preach outside a church building. And Whitfield was doing it. Well, in the course of their overlapping careers for about almost 40 years, there was a love-hate relationship there. The big tension between the two was on the doctrine of grace and mercy and salvation, because the Wesleyans, John and Charles Wesley, had a more Arminian view, sort of what Whitfield called a cheap grace view. And Whitfield's view was more of a Protestant Reformation view that we're all lost, we're all sinners, we can't choose God, God chooses us, and we need a new life and a new birth and a new beginning, and that can only come by the grace of God through faith in Jesus Christ. And the Wesleys would not agree with that. I mean, would not disagree with that, but they would say, yes, but you have to work your way to earn that idea to be able to ask for that grace. So they had a lot of theological tension. Some years they worked fine together, some years they didn't. Whitfield wouldn't budge. Charles Wesley, interestingly, was very fond of George Whitfield and was not a competitor, and Wesley hymns were sung at Whitfield rallies, Whitfield evangelistic meetings. But John, who was the leader of the brothers, John and Charles, there were some personality clashes and maybe some ego involved. But the people have written books about what you just asked, and I answered in 2 minutes, but books have been written about that. Yes, Pastor
I
Bob.
remember hearing a couple quotes too. Whitfield said one time that he felt his followers were a rope of sand, and that Wesley knew how to pen his sheep. In other words, how to disciple better than he did.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Yes, and one of the points I meant, thank you. One of the things I mentioned about one of his flaws is, what do you do after evangelism? Remember that? Wesley knew. He was expert at it. And he actually sent some of his missionaries, some of his Methodist missionaries, to go behind George Whitfield in the American colonies to gather together these people who had experienced regeneration and form them into societies, is the word they use, small group societies that would become Methodist churches. Was that sheep stealing? Or was it just Whitfield negligent and somebody came out behind? Books and articles have been written about that too. I don't know. Anybody else? Books are downstairs. Sale. And my wife will do the bookkeeping for that. Thanks, Pastor Bob.